Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something that sounds dramatic but ends up being wonderfully, soothingly mundane. The seven ancient wonders of the world. You know them. The pyramid, the lighthouse, the hanging gardens that may not have hung at all. But here's the thing nobody tells you in those glossy history documentaries. Most of them didn't disappear in catastrophic Hollywood moments. They just stopped being useful. And then people took them apart, brick by brick, stone by stone. Like dismantling IKEA furniture, except in reverse and over several centuries. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly how the ancient world's greatest hits became the ancient world's greatest recycling projects. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love knowing this little community spans time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the only wonder still standing. The Great Pyramid of Giza. You've seen in photos. That massive, stepped, sandy beige triangle rising from the desert. But here's what you might not know. It didn't always look like that. For most of its life, nearly 4,000 years, the Great Pyramid was smooth, gleaming, covered from base to tip in polished, white limestone casing stones that reflected the sun like a beacon. The ancient Egyptians called it Iqaet, meaning glorious light. On a clear day, you could see it shining from miles away across the Nile Valley. Imagine that, a perfectly smooth, white pyramid catching the desert sun. It must have looked like something from another world. And at the very top, a golden capstone, a pyramidion, that caught the first and last rays of each day. The whole thing was a monument to precision. Each casing stone was cut so precisely that you couldn't slip a credit card between them. Well, if credit cards had existed, you get the idea. But by the 14th century CE, most of those gleaming stones were gone. The pyramid you see today, that rough, stepped exterior, is actually the inner core structure. The skeleton, if you will. So where did all that beautiful white limestone go? Simple answer, Cairo. After a massive earthquake in 1303 CE loosened many of the casing stones, the city of Cairo was booming, expanding, building mosques, palaces, fortresses. And right there, just across the river, sat a pyramid covered in pre-cut, pre-polished, perfectly sized building stones. It was less like theft and more like shopping at a very convenient, very old hardware store. The Sultan Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan used pyramid stones for his mosque in the 1350s. Several other mosques and buildings followed suit. Why quarry new limestone from distant hills when perfectly good stones were sitting right there? This is the practical logic that doomed most of the ancient wonders. They weren't destroyed by war or catastrophe. Well, not entirely. They were destroyed by convenience. Historians still argue whether the pyramid lost most of its casing gradually over centuries or in a concentrated flurry of post-earthquake salvage. The truth is probably both. Some stones fell. Some were pried loose. Some were just taken. By the time European travelers started visiting Egypt in the 1700s, the transformation was complete. One traveler, Frederick Lewis Norton, wrote in 1737 that the pyramid looked like a giant staircase. No mention of gleaming white. No mention of gold. Just raw, weathered, ancient stone. Here's the eccentric detail. A few of the original casing stones still survive. Not on the pyramid, but scattered around Cairo in various buildings. And at the pyramid's base, you can still see a few in place, smooth, angled, precisely cut. They're like fossils of former glory. Touch one, and you're touching the same surface an ancient Egyptian stonemason polished 4,500 years ago. That's a long, slow, quiet kind of time travel. The Great Pyramid survived because of its sheer mass. It's estimated that 2.3 million blocks make up its core. Even after losing its outer shell, even after centuries of stone robbery, there was simply too much pyramid to disappear completely. But the others? The other six wonders? They weren't so lucky. And that's where things get really interesting. Or really boring, depending on how you look at it. Spoiler, we're aiming for boring. The sleepy kind. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop. We've got a long, gentle journey ahead, and there's no rush. None at all. Now let's talk about the wonder that might never have existed at all. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. You've probably seen the artist's renderings. Lush terraces dripping with vines and flowers, cascading down like a green waterfall in the middle of the desert. Exotic plant from across the known world, watered by some ingenious ancient irrigation system. It sounds magical, romantic, the kind of thing a love-struck king would build for his homesick wife. And that's exactly the story we've been told. King Nebuchadnezzar II built the gardens around 600 BCE for his wife, Amytis of Media. She missed the green mountains of her homeland, so he recreated them for her in the flat, dusty plains of Babylon. Sweet, right? Except here's the problem. There's no solid evidence the gardens were ever in Babylon. No Babylonian texts mention them. Not one. And the Babylonians loved writing things down. They documented everything, building projects, astronomical observations, grocery lists carved in cuneiform. But the Hanging Gardens? Silence. The only accounts come from Greek and Roman writers who lived centuries after the gardens supposedly existed. Strabo, Philo of Byzantium, Diodorus Siculus. They all described the gardens in loving detail. But none of them had actually seen them. They were writing from hearsay, from travelers' tales, from cultural telephone games played across generations. Historians still argue whether the gardens were real or simply a case of mistaken identity. Some believe they existed, but were wildly exaggerated. Others think they're completely mythical, a story that grew better with each retelling. But here's where it gets interesting. In the 1990s, British scholar Stephanie Dalley proposed a radical theory. What if the gardens existed, but in the wrong city? What if they were in Nineveh, not Babylon? Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, about 300 miles north of Babylon. And the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled about a century before Nebuchadnezzar, definitely built elaborate gardens. He wrote about them extensively. He described a complex aqueduct system bringing water from the mountains. He mentioned exotic plants and elevated terraces. He even called them a wonder for all peoples. Sound familiar? Dalley's theory is that later Greek writers confused the two cities. Ancient Mesopotamia was complicated, and to outsiders, one great city might easily blur into another. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE, just a few decades before the gardens were supposedly built in Babylon. Perhaps the stories got tangled. Perhaps the magnificent gardens of Nineveh were misremembered as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It's the kind of historical mix-up that happens more often than you'd think. But let's say the gardens were real, and they were in Babylon. How did they disappear? Well, that part's actually straightforward. Time and neglect. Babylon declined after Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE. The city that had once been the crown jewel of Mesopotamia slowly emptied. People moved away. Trade routes shifted. And those elaborate gardens, with their complex irrigation systems and carefully maintained terraces, required constant care. Without maintenance, they would have fallen apart quickly. Desert plants are hardy. Garden plants are not. Cut off the water supply, and everything dies within weeks. Let the irrigation channels clog, and the whole system fails. Within a generation or two, there would have been nothing left but crumbling mud brick foundations. And mud brick, unlike stone, doesn't last. It melts in rain. It erodes in wind. Given enough time, it returns to dust. By the time the first archaeologists arrived in the 19th century, Babylon was a landscape of tells, those characteristic mounds that mark ancient settlements. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated Babylon from 1899 to 1917. He found magnificent structures, the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, palace foundations. But gardens? Nothing conclusive. He identified one vaulted structure that might have supported elevated terraces. But it could just as easily have been a storage facility. Here's the eccentric detail. Some scholars think the hanging in Hanging Gardens is a mistranslation. The Greek word kermastos can mean hanging, but also overhanging or terraced. So we might be imagining something far more vertical and dramatic than what actually existed. Maybe they were just really nice terrace gardens. Not floating, not suspended by chains or ropes. Just tiered, which is still impressive, but admittedly less magical. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to the Hanging Gardens. They might have crumbled into the Mesopotamian plain. They might have been in a different city entirely. They might have been a beautiful story that took on a life of its own. But isn't there something peaceful about that uncertainty? Not everything needs a definitive ending. Sometimes history is just a collection of maybes and perhaps, gently fading into comfortable ambiguity. Let that thought settle. There's no test at the end of this. No quiz on dates and details. Just the soft rhythm of old stories dissolving into even older ground. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, was the ancient world's tallest structure for over 1,000 years. Standing somewhere between 330 and 450 feet tall, depending on which ancient source you trust. That's roughly the height of a modern 35-story building. Built around 280 BCE on the island of Pharos in Alexandria's harbor, it guided ships safely into port for centuries. 3 tiers. A square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top with the fire that never went out. At least, it wasn't supposed to go out. Mirrored bronze plates reflected the flames light out to sea, visible for miles. Some sources claim you could see it from 35 miles away. That's probably an exaggeration, but even half that distance would be remarkable. The lighthouse wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. White marble columns, decorative friezes, possibly statues of Poseidon or other sea gods at various levels. It was architecture as advertisement. Look what Alexandria can build. Look what we can do. And for about 1,500 years, it stood, doing its job, burning its nightly fire. But then the earth started shaking. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on a complex network of tectonic faults. The African plate grinding against the Eurasian plate, creating stress, releasing energy, making the ground dance in ways ancient builders couldn't predict. The lighthouse survived countless small earthquakes. Built solid, built to last. But big earthquakes, the kind that reshape coastlines, those were different. The first major damage came in 796 CE, an earthquake strong enough to topple the lighthouse's top section. Contemporary accounts describe the upper circular level collapsing, the fire falling dark for the first time in 1,000 years. But Alexandria rebuilt it. Shorter now, squatter, but still functional, still guiding ships. Then came the earthquake of 1303 CE, the same one that loosened the Great Pyramid's casing stones. This one was catastrophic for the lighthouse. Massive damage to the remaining structure, large sections collapsing into the harbor. But still it stood, partially, stubbornly. Arab accounts from this period describe it as ruined, but not entirely gone. A damaged skeleton of its former self. And then 1323 CE brought another quake. This one finished the job. The lighthouse, or what was left of it, finally collapsed completely into the Mediterranean. Stones tumbling into the water, sending up massive waves, creating an instant artificial reef. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Because earthquakes didn't destroy the lighthouse alone. People helped. In 1480 CE, the Mamluk Sultan Qaitbay decided to build a fortress on the exact spot where the lighthouse had stood. And conveniently, there were massive limestone blocks scattered all around the site. Some still standing in partial walls. Others sunken in the shallow water. Pre-cut, pre-shaped, ready to use. So the citadel of Qaitbay rose from the lighthouse's bones. The fortress still stands today, a medieval castle built from ancient wonder. If you visit Alexandria, you can walk through it, touch its walls, and know you're touching stones that once held up one of the tallest structures in the ancient world. Historians still argue about the exact timeline of the lighthouse's destruction. Some emphasize the earthquakes, acts of God, unavoidable, natural. Others point to the human element, neglect during Alexandria's decline, stone robbery, deliberate dismantling. The truth is probably that earthquakes did the dramatic work, while human pragmatism finished the cleanup. Nature knocked it down. People carted it away. Here's the eccentric detail. In 1994, French archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur began underwater excavations in Alexandria's harbor. His team found massive granite and limestone blocks scattered across the seafloor. Columns, statues, architectural fragments. They mapped over 3,000 pieces, some weighing up to 75 tons. The lighthouse's remains are still there, just underwater, slowly being colonized by coral and fish. It's become an artificial reef, supporting an entire ecosystem. The light that once guided sailors now provides shelter for grouper and moray eels. There's something poetic about that. A monument to human ambition becoming a monument to nature's patient reclamation. Emperor's team even recovered statues, possibly of Ptolemy II, the pharaoh who commissioned the lighthouse. They're in Alexandria's museums now. Pulled from a sea after spending 700 years underwater. Barnacle-encrusted, salt-stained, but recognizably royal. The lighthouse's destruction wasn't a single moment. It was a cascade of events spread across centuries. Earthquake damage, partial collapse, reconstruction, more earthquakes, neglect, final collapse, stone robbery, fortress construction. Layer upon layer of endings. Each generation dealing with what the previous one left behind. It's exhausting just thinking about it. So don't think too hard. Just picture those massive stones settling into the seafloor, the water going still again, fish beginning to explore the new landscape of fallen columns and toppled walls. Everything returning to quiet, the way it always does, eventually. No rush. We're not going anywhere. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was destroyed twice. Once by arson, once by religious ideology. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with what it was. The Temple of Artemis, also called the Artemision, was one of the largest temples in the ancient Greek world. Built around 550 BCE in the city of Ephesus, on the western coast of what's now Turkey. It was dedicated to Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and childbirth. Though the Artemis worshipped here was a bit different from the standard Greek version. More Eastern, more mystical, often depicted with multiple breasts, or possibly egg-shaped symbols representing fertility. The temple itself was massive, about 425 feet long and 225 feet wide, supported by 127 columns, each 60 feet tall. Imagine a forest of marble pillars, each one taller than a 5-story building. The roof was cedar wood. The doors were cypress. Inside, a statue of Artemis covered in gold and precious stones. The whole thing was sponsored by Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia. When ancient people said someone was as rich as Croesus, this temple was partly why. It stood for about 200 years. A pilgrimage site, a treasury, a sanctuary. And then, on July 21st, 356 BCE, a man named Herostratus set it on fire. Why? Because he wanted to be famous. That's it. That's the whole motivation. Herostratus was a nobody, a shepherd or laborer, depending on which source you read. And he wanted his name remembered forever. So he burned down one of the 7 wonders of the world. It worked, obviously. We're still talking about him 2,400 years later. The ancient authorities were so appalled by his crime and his reasoning that they tried to erase his name from history. They made it illegal to mention him. But of course, that just made historians more determined to record it. The Streisand effect, ancient edition. Here's the eccentric detail. According to legend, the temple burned on the same night Alexander the Great was born. Later writers claimed Artemis was too busy attending Alexander's birth to save her own temple. It's a lovely story, almost certainly invented after the fact to make Alexander seem even more cosmically significant. But it stuck. The Ephesians rebuilt the temple almost immediately, even grander than before. Taller columns, more elaborate decorations. Alexander the Great himself offered to fund the reconstruction, but the Ephesians politely declined. They'd rather do it themselves. Thank you very much. The new temple stood for about 600 years. It survived the rise of Rome. It survived countless wars. It became one of the most famous pilgrimage destinations in the ancient world. The city of Ephesus thrived partly because of the tourism the temple generated. You can almost hear the ancient tour guides. Step right up, see the wonder of the world, offerings accepted at the altar. But then Christianity arrived, and Christianity had opinions about pagan temples. Strong opinions. In 268 CE, the Goths raided Ephesus and damaged the temple. But it was repaired, still standing, still functioning. The final blow came in 401 CE. By this point, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were being shut down, converted, or demolished across the empire. A Christian mob, possibly encouraged by Archbishop John Chrysostom, destroyed the Temple of Artemis. Deliberately, systematically. They tore down the columns, smashed the statues, burned what would burn. It wasn't war. It wasn't accident. It was ideology. Historians still argue about the exact details, whether it was one large mob or gradual dismantling over several years, whether church authorities officially sanctioned it or just looked the other way. But the result was the same. By the mid-5th century, the temple was gone. Stones were carted away to build churches, houses, fortifications. The site was abandoned. The memory faded. For over 1,000 years, nobody even knew exactly where the temple had stood. Ephesus itself declined and was eventually abandoned. The harbors silted up. The city died. And the Temple of Artemis became a field of marshy ground. In 1869, British archaeologist John Turtle would begin searching for the temple. It took him 6 years of digging through mud and mosquito-infested swamps. But in 1875, he found it. Or rather, he found the foundation. A few column bases. Some scattered architectural fragments. Enough to confirm, this was it. This was where one of the 7 wonders had stood. Today, only one column has been re-erected at the site. A single pillar standing in a field, assembled from original fragments. It's about 45 feet tall, not even the full original height. But it gives you a sense of scale. One column in an empty field, where once there were 127. That's what religious transformation looks like. That's what happens when the old gods are replaced by new ones. The stones don't vanish into thin air. They just get repurposed, built into the foundations of something else. Something the next generation values more. Let that image rest in your mind. One column, an empty field, the slow wash of history. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the patient work of time and changing beliefs. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was made of ivory and gold, which is a polite way of saying it was made of money. Lots and lots of money. Created by the sculptor Phidias around 435 BCE, the statue sat inside the temple of Zeus at Olympia, Greece. The temple itself was impressive. Massive Doric columns, elaborate pediments covered in sculptures depicting the life of Zeus. But the statue inside, that's what people traveled to see. Zeus sat on a throne made of cedar wood, inlaid with ebony, ivory, gold, and precious stones. The god himself was about 40 feet tall. His skin was ivory. His robes were hammered gold. In his right hand, he held a small statue of Nike, goddess of victory. In his left, a scepter topped with an eagle. His head nearly touched the temple ceiling. Ancient writers described the overwhelming sense of awe visitors felt seeing it for the first time. The Greek geographer Strabo wrote that if Zeus ever stood up, he'd go through the roof. Which raises an interesting question about divine furniture design, but we'll let that go. The statue required constant maintenance. Ivory cracks in dry air. Gold tarnishes. Phidias's descendants maintain a workshop at Olympia specifically to care for the statue. They kept a shallow pool of olive oil at its base. The oil created humidity that prevented the ivory from splitting. Imagine that job, hereditary custodian of Zeus, polishing god parts for a living. The statue stood for about 800 years. 8 centuries of Olympic Games held in its honor. 8 centuries of pilgrims leaving offerings at its base. But by the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was Christian, and pagan temples were becoming uncomfortable reminders of the old ways. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius I banned the Olympic Games. Too pagan, too connected to the old gods. The Temple of Zeus was closed. But here's where the story gets murky. because nobody knows exactly what happened to the statue after that. There are two main theories, and historians argue about which is more likely. Theory 1. The statue was destroyed in Olympia when the temple burned sometime in the 5th or 6th century CE. Several ancient sources mention fires at Olympia. Earthquakes damaged the temple. Neglect let it decay. Eventually, something caught fire, maybe lightning, maybe human error, and the whole thing burned. The gold could be salvaged and melted down, but the ivory? That would have burned or been too damaged to save. This theory has the statue ending where it began, at Olympia, consumed by flames. Theory 2. The statue was transported to Constantinople before the temple burned. This version claims that wealthy collectors, or perhaps even imperial authorities, moved the statue to the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Constantinople was becoming a museum of classical treasures. Emperors liked showing off Rome's cultural heritage, even if they didn't worship those gods anymore. According to this theory, the statue was installed in a palace or public building in Constantinople. And then, sometime in the 5th century, maybe 475 CE, a fire destroyed the building. Byzantine historian Georgios Kadrinos mentioned this fire and listed the statue of Zeus among the treasures lost. But Kadrinos was writing 600 years after the event. His account might be accurate, or it might be confused with other fires, other statues, other losses. Memory gets fuzzy over 6 centuries. Historians still argue about which version is correct. Did Zeus burn in Olympia or Constantinople? Did he ever leave Greece at all? We may never know. Here's the eccentric detail. Phidias, the sculptor, allegedly hid a secret self-portrait in the statue's design. Supposedly, you could see his face reflected in the polished shield at Zeus's feet. It's probably apocryphal, ancient celebrity gossip, but it's a lovely thought. The artist hiding himself in plain sight, gazing up at his god from a mirror only he knew about. What we do know is that by the 6th century, the statue was gone, either burned in Greece or burned in Turkey, either neglected to death or moved and then destroyed. The end result was the same: no more Zeus. The temple at Olympia itself gradually fell apart. Earthquakes in 522 and 551 CE caused major damage. The site was abandoned. Eventually, the Alpheos River flooded and buried the ruins under layers of mud and sediment. For over 1,000 years, Olympia was just a name in ancient texts. In the 1800s, archaeologists excavated the site and found the temple foundations. They even found Phidias's workshop, pottery shards with his name on them, tools, molds for crafting gold drapery. But the statue itself? Nothing. Not a single piece of ivory. Not a scrap of gold. Just descriptions in ancient texts and images on coins. That's all that's left of Zeus. Words and tiny stamp profiles. A 40-foot god reduced to scholarly footnotes. It's strangely appropriate when you think about it. The gods themselves were already fading when the statue was destroyed. Fewer believers each generation. Fewer prayers offered. Fewer games held in their honor. The statue's disappearance just made official what was already happening. Zeus was becoming a story, a memory of a time when people believed different things. Let that thought settle gently. Gods fading into stories. Statues fading into words. Everything eventually becoming just another layer in the archaeological record. Or not even that. Sometimes just gone. And that's okay. That's just how time works. Slowly, quietly, with occasional fires. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was a tomb built by a widow for her husband, and also, allegedly, her brother, because ancient Korea had interesting ideas about keeping power in the family. The tomb was commissioned around 353 BCE by Artemisia II. Her husband and brother, Mausolus, had just died. He'd been the satrap, the regional governor of Korea, a region in what's now southwestern Turkey. Artemisia loved him, or at least she wanted everyone to think she did. So she built him the most elaborate tomb the ancient world had ever seen. So elaborate that his name became the word we use for any grand tomb: mausoleum. The structure was about 148 feet tall. It had 3 sections: a rectangular base, a middle section with 36 columns and a pyramid-shaped roof. At the very top, a marble chariot pulled by 4 horses, a quadriga, with statues of Mausolus and Artemisia riding in it. The whole thing was covered in sculptural reliefs, battles between Greeks and Amazons, hunting scenes, mythological figures. The best sculptors of the age worked on it: Scopas, Bryaxis, Leocares, Timotheus, each one responsible for a different side of the building. It was white marble, gleaming, visible from ships entering the harbor, a monument to love or power or both. It stood for about 1,500 years, survived Alexander the Great's conquests, survived the rise and fall of Rome. By the medieval period, Halicarnassus, by then called Bodrum, was a quiet backwater. The mausoleum was still standing, but damaged. Earthquakes had taken their toll. The 12th and 13th centuries brought several significant quakes to the region. By the early 1400s, the structure was partially collapsed. The upper sections had fallen. The chariot was long gone, but the base was still intact, and the ruins were still impressive. Then the Crusaders arrived, specifically the Knights Hospitaller of St. John. In 1402, they established a presence in Bodrum and decided to build a castle, the Castle of St. Peter, to defend against Ottoman expansion. And right there, conveniently located, was a massive pile of pre-cut marble blocks, the remains of the mausoleum. Why quarry new stone when perfectly good marble was sitting right there? So they took it, block by block, statue by statue. They built the castle walls from pieces of one of the 7 wonders of the world. In 1522, they even used sculptural reliefs to fill in gaps in the castle walls. Carved panels depicting ancient Greek myths, just stuffed into walls like decorative bricks. The knights didn't see themselves as vandals. They needed a fortress. The mausoleum was already ruined. Practical thinking. The same logic that stripped the Great Pyramid's casing stones. The same logic that turned the Lighthouse of Alexandria into the citadel of Cape Bay. Old monuments are just very patient building supply warehouses. Here's the eccentric detail. In the 1850s, British archaeologist Charles Newton excavated the site. He found a foundation. He found pieces of the famous sculptures. And he found marble blocks built into the castle walls with Greek inscriptions still visible. He even negotiated with local authorities to remove some sculptures from the castle and ship them to the British Museum, where they remain today. The mausoleum's lions, fragments of the Amazon frieze, pieces of the chariot horses, all sitting in London, far from the Turkish coast where they were carved 2,300 years ago. Newton also found the burial chamber itself, deep underground, cut into bedrock. It had been looted long ago, probably in antiquity. No trace of Mausolus or Artemisia. No golden artifacts. No treasure. Just an empty room where 2 powerful people were once laid to rest. Historians still argue about when exactly the mausoleum was dismantled. Some say the knights did most of the damage in the 1400s and early 1500s. Others argue it was a gradual process. Earthquakes knocked it down. Then various groups salvaged stones over centuries. The truth is probably that earthquakes did most of the work and humans finished the job. Nature provides the demolition. People provide the cleanup crew. It's a partnership that's destroyed most of the wonders. Today, if you visit Bodrum, you can see both sites. The Castle of St. Peter still stands, a medieval fortress built from ancient stone. And the mausoleum site itself, a foundation, some scattered blocks, a few reconstructed sections showing what the scale might have been. But mostly it's empty space, the outline of where something magnificent once stood. There's something almost meditative about that. Standing in an empty foundation, trying to imagine 148 feet of marble rising above you. The chariot, the columns, the sculptural friezes, all of it gone except for the ghost of the footprint. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we didn't actually mention yet? Well, consider this a preview. Ancient people were practical, resourceful. They used what was available. Whether that was crocodile dung for sun protection, which they actually did, or ancient marble for castle construction. Nothing was too sacred to be useful. And maybe that's not such a bad philosophy. Maybe monuments aren't meant to last forever. Maybe they're meant to serve one purpose, then be transformed into something else. Tomb becomes fortress. Lighthouse becomes castle. One generation's wonder becomes another generation's building materials. It's recycling on a time scale that makes our aluminum cans look insignificant. Let that thought drift. Nothing permanent. Everything eventually repurposed. Even monuments to eternal love. Even tombs for kings. Just stones waiting patiently to become something else. The Colossus of Rhodes lasted 56 years. That's it. 5.5 decades of standing, then 8 centuries of lying down. It's the shortest-lived wonder, and somehow the most famous for being broken. Built around 280 BCE to celebrate Rhodes's victory over an invading army, the Colossus was a bronze statue of the sun god Helios. About 108 feet tall, roughly the height of the Statue of Liberty from heel to top of head. It stood at the harbor entrance of the city of Rhodes, on the Greek island of the same name. Though probably not straddling the harbor with one foot on each side, as popular images suggest. That's a medieval invention. The statue would have been structurally impossible in that position, and ships would have constantly crashed into its ankles. More likely, it stood on a marble pedestal on one side of the harbor, overlooking the entrance. Still impressive, still visible from far out at sea. The sculptor was Chares of Lindos, a student of Lysippos, one of Alexander the Great's favorite artists. Chares spent 12 years building it. The construction method was ingenious, an iron framework with bronze plates attached to the outside. The interior was filled with stone blocks for stability. As the statue grew taller, workers built an earth ramp around it to reach higher levels. When it was finished, they removed the ramp, and suddenly Rhodes had a giant bronze god watching over its harbor. The bronze came from melted-down weapons and siege equipment left behind by the invading army. There's something poetic about that. Swords and catapults transformed into a statue celebrating peace. For 56 years it stood, a symbol of Rhodes's power and prosperity, a landmark for sailors, a wonder for travelers. And then, in 226 BCE, an earthquake hit. Not even a particularly massive one by Mediterranean standards, but strong enough. The statue snapped at the knees and toppled forward. Imagine the sound, the crash. 108 feet of bronze god hitting the ground, probably taking out a few buildings in the process. The people of Rhodes were devastated. They consulted the oracle at Delphi about rebuilding. The oracle's response was basically, don't. Rebuilding would offend Helios. So the broken Colossus stayed where it fell. For 800 years, 8 centuries of lying in pieces near the harbor. Ancient tourists came to see it. Pliny the Elder wrote that, even lying down, few people could wrap their arms around the statue's thumb. The broken fingers were taller than most statues. It became a tourist attraction in its ruined state. Come see the fallen giant. Bring the whole family. Here's where the story gets hazy. In 654 CE, Arab forces conquered Rhodes. According to some sources, they sold the bronze remains to a Jewish merchant from Edessa. The merchant supposedly needed 900 camels to transport all the metal. The bronze was then melted down and sold as scrap. That's the traditional story. But historians argue about whether this actually happened. Some point out that 900 camels seems excessive, possibly an exaggeration to emphasize how huge the statue was. Others note that bronze is valuable. After 800 years lying around, the metal might have been gradually stripped and sold off piece by piece. Maybe the Arab story is just when the last big chunk disappeared. Or maybe it's entirely mythical, and the Colossus had already been salvaged centuries earlier. We don't know. What we do know is that by the medieval period, there was no trace of it. No bronze fragments. No iron framework. Nothing. Just stories and ancient descriptions. Here's the eccentric detail. There's an old superstition that was supposedly why the Rhodians left the statue lying there for so long. A prophecy claimed that when the Colossus fell, it would be a sign that the world was ending, or at least that Rhodes's power was ending. So moving it felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that the Golden Age was over. Better to leave it lying there as a reminder of former glory than to cart it away and admit it was truly gone. That kind of thinking is very human. We've all kept broken things longer than we should, hoping that somehow not throwing them away means they're not really broken. The Colossus had the shortest active lifespan of any wonder, but it had the longest afterlife as a ruin. For 800 years, it was more famous broken than it ever was whole. People traveled from across the Mediterranean to see the fallen god, to touch the massive bronze fragments, to stand beside a thumb the size of a person and contemplate the ambition of ancient people who thought they could build gods. There's something almost peaceful about that image. A giant statue lying down for 8 centuries. Not destroyed, not gone, just resting, taking a very, very long nap by the harbor, until finally someone decided all that bronze was too valuable to leave lying around. And it was gone for real. Melted, reformed, turned into coins or weapons or everyday objects. The sun god became doorknobs and belt buckles. Isn't that always the way? The mighty brought low, the sacred made mundane. Bronze is bronze, whether it's shaped like a god or a cooking pot. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift to that harbor. The sound of waves, the creak of ships, and somewhere nearby, a giant bronze figure lying peacefully on its side. Not standing guard anymore. Not watching the harbor. Just existing. Just being. For 800 years of unhurried time. That's not a bad way to spend 8 centuries. Here's a question nobody asked in the ancient world. Shouldn't we preserve this for future generations? Because the answer would have been why. We think of the 7 wonders as precious cultural heritage, irreplaceable treasures that should have been protected at all costs. But the ancient people who lived among them didn't think that way. They thought of them as buildings. Impressive buildings, sure, but still just buildings. And buildings serve purposes. When those purposes end, the buildings become something else. Raw materials, foundations for new construction, convenient quarries. The concept of historical preservation is shockingly modern. For most of human history, the past was just the past. Useful if it could teach you something or provide building materials. Otherwise, not particularly worth maintaining. Consider the Romans. They were great builders, great engineers, but they had no problem tearing down Republican-era structures to build imperial monuments. Old temple, great foundation for a new basilica. Ancient walls, perfect stone for an aqueduct. The past was a resource, not a responsibility. Even the Greeks, who we think of as culturally sophisticated, regularly built new temples on the foundations of old ones. They didn't preserve the old structure. They cannibalized it. This wasn't disrespect. It was just pragmatism. Stone is expensive to quarry. Labor is expensive. If perfectly good stone is sitting right there in a structure you no longer need, why not use it? The medieval world operated on the same principle. When the Roman Empire fell, Europe was suddenly full of abandoned Roman buildings. Amphitheaters, aqueducts, temples, baths. Nobody was using them anymore, so they became quarries. The Colosseum in Rome lost its outer marble cladding to Renaissance builders. That marble is now in St. Peter's Basilica and various Roman palaces. The Colosseum survived only because it was too big to completely dismantle before people started thinking maybe they should keep it around. Here's the thing. Preservation requires resources, time, money, labor. And for most of history, those resources were desperately needed just for survival. Cities in decline don't have the luxury of maintaining monuments. They're trying to feed people, defend against invaders, keep infrastructure functioning. An earthquake-damaged lighthouse isn't a priority when your granaries are empty. A pagan temple isn't worth maintaining when you need stone for city walls. Historians still argue about when the shift toward preservation thinking began. Some point to the Renaissance, when European scholars started valuing classical antiquity. Others argue it didn't really take hold until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of archaeology as a discipline. The first real laws protecting ancient monuments came in the 1800s. Before that, if you owned land with ruins on it, those ruins were yours to do with as you pleased. Want to build a farmhouse from temple stones? Go ahead. Want to grind up marble statues for lime powder? Nobody's stopping you. It wasn't vandalism. It was just using what was available. Here's the eccentric detail. There's a wonderful term in archaeology, spoliation. It means reusing stone or architectural elements from older buildings. It's everywhere once you start looking for it. Medieval churches with Roman columns, Islamic mosques with Byzantine capitals, Renaissance palaces with ancient inscriptions built upside down into walls. The past constantly being recycled into the present. And for most of human history, that was just how things worked. The wonders fell victim to this same practical logic. The mausoleum became a castle because Crusaders needed defenses. The lighthouse became a fortress because the Mamluks needed coastal protection. The Temple of Artemis became churches and houses because Ephesus needed buildings. Nobody sat around thinking, but what about the historical significance? They were thinking, we need walls, and there's stone right there. It's only from our modern perspective, with our museums and UNESCO World Heritage Sites and cultural preservation grants, that this seems tragic. To the people doing it, it was just sensible. Use what you have. Waste nothing. Even gods can be repurposed. There's something almost refreshing about that attitude. No sentimentality. No hand-wringing about cultural loss. Just the practical work of building today from yesterday's materials. Of course, it means we lost the wonders. And that is genuinely sad. But it also means those wonders never really disappeared. They transformed. They're still there, just in different forms. Walk through Cairo, and you're walking past pyramid stones. Visit Bodrum Castle, and you're looking at the mausoleum. The past didn't vanish. It just became part of the present, layer upon layer. Each generation building on what came before. That's not destruction. That's just time, doing what time does. Slowly, patiently, without judgment or regret. Let that settle. No need to mourn what's gone. It's not gone. It's just different. Just somewhere else. Just part of the endless cycle of building, falling, and building again. Let's get specific about that pyramid stone heist, because it's really the perfect case study in how wonders disappear. After the 1303 earthquake, the Great Pyramid's casing stones were loose. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that a determined person with some rope and leverage could pry one free. And Cairo, just across the Nile, was experiencing a building boom. The Mamluk Sultanate was at its height. Sultans were competing to build the grandest mosques, the most impressive madrasas, the finest palaces. Stone was the limiting factor. You could have all the ambition and money in the world, but if you couldn't get stone, you couldn't build. The nearest limestone quarries were miles away in the Mokattam Hills. Quarrying was hard work, slow work, expensive work. But right there, visible from Cairo's eastern edge, was a pyramid covered in perfectly cut, perfectly sized, pre-polished limestone blocks. Some already loosened by earthquake, just waiting to be taken. It wasn't even technically theft. The pyramids had been abandoned for centuries. No guards, no custodians, no official ownership. They were just there, ancient relics from a civilization that no longer existed. Fair game, really. The first major documented stone removal was for the Mosque of Sultan Hassan. Built between 1356 and 1363, it's one of Cairo's most magnificent medieval buildings. Massive, imposing, beautiful, and lined with white limestone that almost certainly came from the pyramid. The texture matches. The dimensions match. Some blocks even show the characteristic angle of the pyramid's casing. The Sultan didn't see this as vandalism. He was building a monument to God. Using stone from a pagan monument seemed perfectly appropriate. One religious structure replaced by another. A transfer of sanctity, if you want to be poetic about it. After Sultan Hassan's mosque, the floodgates opened. Other builders saw that pyramid stone was available. And good quality. Already cut. Already smooth. Why quarry new stone when you could just take some from the pyramid? Over the next few centuries, dozens of Cairo's buildings incorporated pyramid stone. Mosques, houses, fortifications, bridges, the Al Muayyad Mosque, the Cape Bay Complex, various other structures now lost to time. Even some of the buildings that were later demolished to make way from modern Cairo probably contained pyramid stones. So the Great Pyramid is scattered throughout the city, hidden in plain sight. Historians still argue about exactly how much casing stone was removed. Some estimates say most of it was gone by the 16th century. Others argue the process continued into the 1800s, with small-scale stone theft ongoing until European interest in Egyptology made the pyramids important. The truth is probably that the bulk was taken in the medieval period, with smaller thefts continuing for centuries afterward. Here's the eccentric detail. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 included scientists and scholars who documented the pyramids. They noted that even then, local people were still occasionally removing stones. Small scale. A block here, a block there. For house repairs. For new construction. The pyramids were just a communal building supply. One of Napoleon's engineers, Edmé-François Jomard, calculated how much stone had been removed. His estimate: enough to build a wall around France 3 feet high. That's probably an exaggeration, but it gives you a sense of scale. We're not talking about a few stones. We're talking about a significant portion of the pyramid's exterior. What's fascinating is that nobody at the time saw this as a problem. The first complaints about stone removal came from European travelers in the 1700s and 1800s. They were horrified that locals were destroying the pyramids. But to the locals, these were just old buildings, useful for their stone, not particularly sacred, certainly not worth protecting at the expense of practical needs. It's a classic clash of perspectives. The Europeans saw irreplaceable antiquities. The Egyptians saw the convenient quarry that had been there for thousands of years. Both viewpoints are valid in their way. By the late 1800s, the Egyptian government began taking steps to protect the pyramids. Archaeological missions were regulated. Stone removal was prohibited. Guards were posted. But by then, most of the damage was done. The smooth white pyramid was already a step brown one. Today, if you visit Cairo, you can play a kind of historical scavenger hunt. Look at older buildings. Look for white limestone that seems unusually well cut. Look for blocks with that distinctive angle. Chances are you're looking at pieces of the Great Pyramid. The mosque you're admiring might be lined with pharaonic stone. The bridge you're crossing might contain blocks that once caught the desert sun 4,500 years ago. The wonder didn't disappear. It just dispersed, scattered across a city, built into 1,000 different structures. Still there, still visible, just no longer assembled into a pyramid. And in a strange way, that's a kind of immortality. Not the immortality the pharaohs intended, but immortality nonetheless. Their monument became the city. Their pyramid became Cairo itself. Stone by stolen, pragmatic, utterly human stone. Let that image rest. A pyramid dissolving into a city. Slowly, inevitably, over centuries of patient removal, until the distinction between ancient monument and current city becomes meaningless. They're the same thing, just viewed from different angles, different points in time. Let's talk about why earthquakes were so devastating to the wonders. Because it's not just bad luck, it's geology. The Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically active regions in the world. The boundary where the African tectonic plate is slowly colliding with the Eurasian plate. This collision has been happening for millions of years. It's what created the Alps, the Atlas Mountains, the mountains of Greece and Turkey, and it's what causes earthquakes. Lots of them. The ancient people who built the wonders knew earthquakes happened. They'd experienced them. They'd seen the damage. But they didn't understand the underlying geology. They didn't know about tectonic plates or fault lines. They just knew that sometimes the earth shook and buildings fell down. So they built as well as they could and hoped for the best. Some structures were more vulnerable than others. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, for example, was incredibly tall. Over 300 feet of stone stacked vertically. Height makes structures more susceptible to earthquake damage. The taller the building, the more it sways during shaking. And the more it sways, the more stress on the joints and mortar. Ancient builders used lead clamps and bronze pins to hold stones together. But there's only so much those can do when the ground is shaking violently. The lighthouse survived many small earthquakes, but the big ones, the magnitude 7 or 8 events, those were too much. The Colossus of Rhodes had a different vulnerability. It was essentially a hollow bronze shell filled with stone blocks. Tall, top-heavy, standing on relatively slender legs. When the 226 BCE earthquake hit Rhodes, the statue snapped at its weakest point, the knees. It's the same principle that makes modern skyscrapers flexible at their bases. You need to account for movement, or the structure will break where it's most rigid. The Colossus didn't have that flexibility, so it broke. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was damaged by earthquakes in the 12th and 13th centuries. These weren't even the Mediterranean's biggest quakes, but the structure had already been standing for over 1,400 years. Centuries of smaller tremors had weakened the mortar. Rain had eroded the limestone. Settling had created microfractures. By the time the medieval earthquakes hit, the mausoleum was already compromised. The quakes just finished what time it started. Historians still argue about which earthquakes destroyed which wonders. Ancient records are frustratingly vague. They'll mention a great earthquake without specifying its magnitude or exact location. Modern seismologists have tried to reconstruct ancient earthquake patterns using geological evidence. They found evidence of massive quakes in the Mediterranean region throughout ancient and medieval times. But matching specific historical earthquakes to specific damaged structures is difficult, sometimes impossible. Here's what we do know. The Eastern Mediterranean experienced several major earthquake sequences. One in the 4th century CE, another in the 8th century, another in the 11th to 12th centuries, another in the 14th century. Each sequence probably involved multiple large quakes over several decades, and each sequence damaged multiple wonders. The 4th century quakes likely damaged the mausoleum and possibly the Temple of Artemis, though by then it was already abandoned. The 8th century quake damaged the lighthouse. The 12th to 13th century quakes further damaged the mausoleum and possibly toppled what remained of the lighthouse's upper sections. The 14th century quakes, particularly the major one in 1303, did catastrophic damage to both the lighthouse and the Great Pyramid's casing stones. It's death by 1,000 tremors. Not one catastrophic event, but many smaller ones over centuries. Each earthquake doing a little more damage, weakening structures, loosening stones, until finally, something critical fails. Here's the eccentric detail. Ancient builders did try to make structures earthquake-resistant. Greek temples used a technique called flexible jointing. They left tiny gaps between stones that allowed for some movement during shaking. The Parthenon in Athens has survived multiple major earthquakes, partly because of this technique. Roman builders used concrete and vaulting to create more resilient structures. But these techniques only go so far. Against a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake directly beneath your structure, nothing ancient could survive indefinitely. Modern engineers study the ruins of ancient structures to understand earthquake damage patterns. How stones break, how columns topple, how entire buildings pancake downward. It's morbid but useful. The ancient wonders are case studies in structural failure. Their destruction teaches us how to build better today. So in a strange way, they're still serving humanity, just not in the way their builders intended. They're not inspiring awe anymore. They're inspiring building codes. There's something almost comforting about understanding the mechanism of destruction. It wasn't malice. It wasn't stupidity. It was just the earth doing what the earth does. Moving, shifting, releasing energy built up over centuries. And the wonders, magnificent as they were, couldn't withstand that. Nothing can indefinitely. Even modern skyscrapers will eventually fall to earthquakes, given enough time and strong enough shaking. We've just gotten better at delaying the inevitable. Let that thought settle. The earth moves. Buildings fall. It's been happening since humans started building. It'll keep happening long after we're gone. There's something oddly peaceful about that inevitability. Not tragic, just factual. The patient work of geology, slowly rearranging the surface of the planet. One tremor at a time. The Lighthouse of Alexandria had a second life. Or rather, its stones did. In 1477, The Mamluk Sultan Kate Bey visited Alexandria and found the lighthouse ruins still scattered around the old Pharos Island. Some stones standing in partial walls. Others tumbled into the harbor. Still others lying in piles. The Ottomans were expanding their naval power in the Mediterranean. Alexandria needed better coastal defenses. And right there, conveniently located, was a massive pile of pre-cut limestone and granite blocks. Perfect for building a fortress. So that's exactly what Kate Bey did. Between 1477 and 1479, his workers constructed the citadel of Kate Bey on the exact spot where the lighthouse had stood. They didn't even have to move the stones very far. Just sort them, stack them, bind them with fresh mortar. The fortress still stands today. You can visit it, walk through its halls, climb its towers, and know that you're walking through the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Not metaphorically, literally. The stones beneath your feet once held up one of the tallest structures in the ancient world. Now they hold up a medieval fortress. Same stones, different purpose. Archaeological surveys of the citadel have confirmed it. Many of the massive granite blocks in the foundation and lower walls show characteristic ancient construction techniques. Some even have marks consistent with Ptolemaic-era stonework. The fortress builders didn't try to hide this. They weren't embarrassed about using ancient stones. Why would they be? Good stone is good stone, whether it's 1,700 years old or freshly quarried. In fact, ancient stone was often superior. The ancient builders had access to better quarries, more experienced stonecutters. Medieval builders recognized quality when they saw it. The citadel of Kate Bey served its purpose admirably. It defended Alexandria against Ottoman naval raids, later against European colonial ambitions. During Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, French forces bombarded the fortress. It held. During the British bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, it was damaged but not destroyed. Those ancient stones proved remarkably resilient. They'd survived the earthquakes that toppled the lighthouse. Now, they were surviving modern artillery. Today, the citadel houses a naval museum. Tourists wander through, taking photos, admiring the medieval Islamic architecture. Most don't realize they're standing inside a wonder of the ancient world. It's hiding in plain sight. The lighthouse never really disappeared. It just changed shape, from a tall, slender beacon to a low, sturdy fortress. From Greek engineering to Islamic architecture. From guiding ships to defending against them. The transformation is complete, perfect, and it raises an interesting philosophical question. If the stones are still there, still visible, still serving a purpose, did the wonder actually disappear? Or did it just evolve? The modern archaeological site at the Citadel tries to honor both histories. There are information plaques explaining the lighthouse, scale models showing what it might have looked like. And in the harbor, underwater archaeological sites where more lighthouse fragments lie on the seafloor. Visitors can see the fortress made from the lighthouse while reading about the lighthouse itself, past and present occupying the same space. The lighthouse stones didn't just go into the citadel. Some ended up in other Alexandria buildings, medieval houses, mosques, harbor structures. The lighthouse dispersed throughout the city, just like the Great Pyramid dispersed throughout Cairo. Wonders don't disappear cleanly. They fragment, spread out, get absorbed into the fabric of daily life. That ancient fire that guided ships for over 1,000 years, its housing became walls that protected a city for over 500 more. The total lifespan, lighthouse plus fortress, is over 1,700 years and counting. That's not bad for a pile of stone, even if it changed jobs halfway through. There's no moral to this story, no lesson about preservation or loss, just the simple fact of transformation. Old things becoming new things, ancient purposes giving way to modern needs. The patient work of human hands, building and rebuilding with whatever materials are available. Let that image rest in your mind. A fortress standing on an island. Medieval walls containing ancient stones. Two different structures occupying the same footprint across time. Neither one wrong, neither one better. Just different chapters of the same long story. The story of humans building things at the edge of the sea. trying to last, trying to matter, succeeding in their way for as long as they can. Religion has destroyed more wonders than earthquakes ever did. That's not a judgment, just an observation. When belief systems change, the monuments to the old beliefs become uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous. They're reminders of what people used to worship, what they used to value. And new religions often want those reminders gone. The Temple of Artemis is the clearest example. By the late 4th century CE, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Emperor Theodosius I was particularly enthusiastic about eliminating pagan worship. In 391 CE, he issued decrees closing pagan temples throughout the empire. Not just closing them, prohibiting their worship, seizing their assets. The Temple of Artemis had already survived Herostratus's fire and been rebuilt even grander. It had survived Alexander the Great, the Roman conquest, centuries of changing political control. But it couldn't survive religious transformation. In 401 CE, or possibly earlier, sources differ. A Christian mob destroyed it. Archbishop John Chrysostom may have encouraged this, though direct evidence is unclear. What is clear is that the destruction was deliberate, systematic. This wasn't earthquake damage or accidental fire. This was people with hammers and ropes pulling down columns, smashing statues of Artemis, burning wooden elements, erasing a place they now considered evil. The goddess worship that had seemed sacred for 800 years was now demonic. The temple that had attracted pilgrims from across the Mediterranean was now an abomination. So it had to go, and it went. Within a few years, the site was abandoned. Stones were carted away for church construction. The area became fields and then swamps as the local water table shifted. By the Middle Ages, nobody even remembered exactly where it had stood. The statue of Zeus faced similar religious pressure. In 391 CE, the same year Theodosius closed pagan temples, the Olympic Games were banned. Two pagan, two connected to Zeus worship. The temple at Olympia was closed. Whether the statue was destroyed there or transported to Constantinople first, we've discussed. But either way, its fate was sealed by religious change. Nobody wanted a giant golden Zeus anymore. He represented the old ways, the wrong ways. Better to have him gone. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, probably escaped religious destruction simply because they weren't religious. They were gardens, a palace feature, not a temple, not a cult site, just landscaping, however magnificent. Religious zealots don't typically destroy gardens. The Great Pyramid avoided religious destruction for a different reason. By the time Islam arrived in Egypt in the 7th century CE, the pyramids were already ancient mysteries. Nobody worshipped there. Nobody practiced old Egyptian religion. The pyramids were just old buildings. Impressive, but not threatening. Islamic scholars were actually fascinated by them. They studied them, wrote about them. Yes, they took the stones for practical reasons, but not out of religious hostility. The lighthouse and the mausoleum also escaped religious destruction. The lighthouse was purely functional, a navigational aid. The mausoleum was a tomb, not a temple. Neither one posed a religious threat. The Colossus was dedicated to Helios, but it fell before Christianity became dominant in Rhodes. Lucky timing, in a way. It avoided the fate of so many pagan statues smashed in the 4th and 5th centuries. Here's what's striking about religious destruction. It's thorough. When earthquakes damage a building, they leave ruins, foundations, pieces to study. When human beings deliberately destroy something for ideological reasons, they often try to erase it completely. Smash the statues so small they can't be reassembled. Burn everything burnable. Scatter the stones so widely they can't be traced. Historians still argue about how much early Christian destruction of pagan sites was official policy versus mob violence. The truth is probably both. Official policy created the climate. Mobs did the work. And once a temple was destroyed, its stones were fair game for churches and monasteries. There's a grim irony in that. The Temple of Artemis probably ended up built into Christian churches. The goddess's home became God's house. Same stones, different prayers. It happened across the empire. Pagan temples became churches. Temple columns held up Christian roofs. Sometimes the transformation was explicit, a church built directly on temple foundations. Sometimes it was scattered, temple stones dispersed among dozens of buildings. But the pattern was the same. The old religion's physical presence was erased or repurposed. This isn't unique to Christianity, of course. Every major religious shift has destroyed the previous religion's monuments. Muslims destroyed Hindu temples. Hindus destroyed Buddhist stupas. Buddhists repurposed Bon sites. It's a depressingly consistent pattern across cultures and centuries. The new faith proves its dominance by erasing the old faith stones. From our modern perspective, with our museums and preservation ethics, this seems barbaric. But to the people doing it, it seemed righteous. They weren't destroying art. They were destroying idolatry. They weren't erasing history. They were cleansing evil. Motivation matters for understanding, but it doesn't change the result. The Temple of Artemis is gone. The statue of Zeus is gone. And religion, changing, evolving, replacing itself, was a major reason why. Not the only reason, but a major one, perhaps more effective than any earthquake. Because earthquakes are random, impersonal, religious destruction is targeted, intentional. It knows exactly what it wants to erase, and it's very, very good at it. Let that settle without judgment. Just the fact of it. Belief systems change. Monuments fall. The sacred becomes profane. The profane becomes material for new sacred spaces. Round and round, generation after generation, until almost nothing remains but words in old books describing what used to stand. The Crusaders had a complicated relationship with history. On one hand, they were fascinated by the ancient world. They were traveling through lands rich with classical ruins, biblical sites, Roman cities, Greek temples. It must have been overwhelming, like walking through a history book. On the other hand, they needed building materials, and those fascinating ruins were made of very good stone. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus became their primary victim. The Knights Hospitaller, also called the Knights of St. John, established themselves in Bodrum in 1402. They'd been pushed out of other Mediterranean strongholds by Ottoman expansion. Bodrum offered a strategic harbor position, but it needed fortifications, strong walls, towers, battlements, and right there, partially collapsed but still standing, was the mausoleum. Hundreds of tons of pre-cut marble, white, beautiful, perfectly sized for castle construction. The knights didn't see themselves as vandals. They were Christian warriors defending Christendom against Muslim expansion. Using stones from a pagan tomb to build Christian fortifications probably seemed poetically appropriate. One religious structure replacing another, just like the Temple of Artemis becoming churches. The stone removal happened in stages. In 1494, they began major construction on the castle of St. Peter. Workers dismantled the upper sections of the mausoleum. The pyramid roof came down. The columns were toppled. The sculptural friezes were pulled from walls. Some sculptures they kept as decorative elements. Others they broke up and used as fill between wall faces. Still others they burned in lime kilns to make mortar. Yes, burned. Ancient Greek marble sculptures, works by the greatest artists of the classical age, turned into paste for holding stones together. It's almost breathtaking in its pragmatism. In 1522, the Knights did another major stone removal. The Ottomans were threatening. Defenses needed reinforcing. They went back to the mausoleum and took more. This time they used carved relief panels, depicting battles between Greeks and Amazons, as fill stones. Stuffed them into walls, covered them with mortar. Some of these panels were discovered in the 1800s, still embedded in castle walls. Archaeologists had to negotiate their removal. The castle versus the mausoleum. Medieval versus ancient. Which preservation priority wins? The Knights weren't unique in this. Crusaders across the Mediterranean were using ancient ruins as quarries. In Caesarea, they built fortifications from Roman ruins. In Acre, they incorporated ancient columns into medieval walls. In Cyprus, classical temples became castle towers. It was standard practice. Ancient equals available building materials. Here's the economic logic. Quarrying fresh stone required skilled workers, time, and money. You had to find a quarry, extract the stone, transport it, often many miles, cut it, shape it, polish it if necessary. But ancient ruins? The stone was already extracted, already cut, already transported to the site, often already shaped into useful sizes. All you had to do was knock down the old structure and stack the stones into a new one. It was economically irresistible. The knights weren't rich. They were a military order operating on donations and seized assets. They couldn't afford to quarry fresh marble, but they could afford to dismantle a ruin. Historians still argue about whether the knights appreciated the historical significance of what they were destroying. Some point to the fact that they preserved some sculptures as evidence they cared. Others argue that preserving a few decorative pieces doesn't excuse demolishing the whole structure. The truth is probably that they had mixed feelings. This is historically interesting, but we need walls to survive can both be true. Survival tends to win those arguments. Contemporary accounts from the knights mention the mausoleum. They knew it was ancient. They knew it was famous. But they also knew they needed fortifications. And honestly, the mausoleum was already damaged. Earthquakes had done significant harm by the 1400s. The knights weren't demolishing an intact wonder. They were salvaging from a ruin. Does that make it better? Debatable, but it makes it more understandable. The eccentric detail. Some of the mausoleum sculptures that the knights preserved were later built into the castle as decorative elements. You can still see them today. Ancient Greek warriors carved in marble, embedded in medieval stone walls, guarding a fortress built from their own tomb. It's surreal, anachronistic, oddly touching. The past and present literally built into each other. The castle of St. Peter still stands. It's now a museum, the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology. Tourists visit, take photos, admire the medieval architecture, and occasionally, if they look carefully, they spot ancient marble peeking through. A carved foot, part of a frieze, a section of Greek inscription, the mausoleum hiding inside the castle. The wonder that never really vanished, just got repurposed, redistributed, built into something else. The Crusaders didn't destroy the mausoleum out of hatred. They destroyed it out of need. And in a strange way, that need preserved it. If they hadn't built it into the castle, those stones might have been completely lost, scattered, broken down further, vanished. Instead, they're still there, protected by the very walls they became. There's no villain in this story, just people making practical choices with the resources they had. Just history layering itself, building on itself, creating something new from something old, the way it always does, patiently, inevitably, stone by practical stone. The Colossus of Rhodes lay broken for 800 years. Let's sit with that number for a moment. 800 years. That's longer than the entire history of the United States. Longer than the period from the Norman Conquest to today. The statue fell in 226 BCE and remained where it fell until 654 CE. Nobody moved it. Nobody rebuilt it. Nobody even cleared the debris away. For 8 centuries, it was just there, a massive bronze giant lying beside the harbor. Why? The oracle at Delphi said not to rebuild it, which we've mentioned. But that doesn't explain why nobody cleaned up the wreckage. Why leave hundreds of tons of valuable bronze lying around for 800 years? Bronze is expensive, valuable, useful. You can melt it down and make weapons, tools, coins, other statues. The Romans controlled Rhodes for much of this period. They weren't particularly sentimental about Greek monuments. They moved entire Egyptian obelisks to Rome. They hauled off countless Greek statues, but they left the Colossus alone. Here's where it gets interesting. There was apparently a prophecy, or perhaps just a superstition, that moving the Colossus would bring disaster. The details are murky, as prophecies tend to be. Some versions say moving it would cause Rhodes to fall to enemies. Others say it would bring earthquakes or plague. The exact threat doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it, and so nobody touched it. The Colossus became sacred in its brokenness. more powerful as a ruin than it had ever been as an intact statue. Ancient tourists came to see it. Writers described it with awe. Pliny the Elder wrote that few people can make their arms meet round the thumb. Strabo mentioned that the broken pieces were so massive they inspired wonder. The Colossus became more famous fallen than standing. It's the same phenomenon that makes ruins romantic. Something about brokenness captures the imagination. An intact statue is impressive. A fallen giant is mythical. The Colossus lying there became a meditation on the impermanence of human achievement. A reminder that even the mightiest works eventually fall. Very philosophical. Very Greek. For 800 years, Rhodes' identity was tied to this broken statue. The island where the giant fell. It was a tourist attraction, a wonder in itself. The broken wonder. Then in 654 CE, Arab forces conquered Rhodes. And according to traditional accounts, they didn't care about prophecies. They saw bronze. Valuable bronze. So they sold it to a Jewish merchant from Edessa, a city in what's now southeastern Turkey. The merchant supposedly needed 900 camels to transport all the metal. This story has been repeated for over 1,000 years. But modern historians are skeptical. First, 900 camels seems like an exaggeration. The kind of detail that gets added to make a story more impressive. Second, bronze is heavy, but not that heavy. Modern calculations suggest the Colossus would have weighed around 80 to 100 tons. That's a lot, but not 900 camels worth. More like 100 to 150 camels if you're actually transporting metal. Third, there's very little contemporary documentation of this event. The story comes from later Byzantine chroniclers who weren't eyewitnesses. So what actually happened? Several theories exist. Theory 1. The story is basically true, just exaggerated. The Arabs did sell the bronze, but the camel number got inflated over retellings. Theory 2. The bronze had already been gradually removed over the centuries. Bit by bit, piece by piece. By the time the Arabs arrived, there wasn't much left to sell. The 900 camel story is a legend explaining why there's no trace of the Colossus anymore. Theory 3. The Colossus was removed much earlier, perhaps in the Roman period, and the Arab story is completely fabricated. Medieval writers needed an explanation for why the famous statue wasn't there anymore. The Arab conquest provided a convenient scapegoat. Historians still argue about which theory is most likely. The truth is we may never know. What we do know is that by the medieval period, the Colossus was gone. No trace of bronze. No trace of the iron framework. Not even clear evidence of where exactly it had stood. Rhodes had other things to worry about. Invasions. Pirates. Economic decline. The memory of the giant statue faded into legend. Here's the eccentric detail. Some modern archaeologists have searched for the Colossus's base. If it really stood for 56 years, there should be foundation evidence. But they haven't found anything definitive. Either the foundation was later built over, or the statue's location wasn't where we think it was, or the base was entirely removed centuries ago. The Colossus has vanished so completely that we can't even be sure where it stood. That's a special kind of gone. Not just destroyed, erased. Removed from the physical world and existing only in texts and imagination. In a way, the Colossus's brokenness gave a longer life. If it had stayed standing, it might have been torn down during Christian anti-pagan campaigns. But lying broken, it was harmless. Just scrap metal. It survived as a ruin far longer than it would have as a functioning statue. Until finally, someone decided scrap metal was too valuable to leave lying around. And then it became doorknobs and belt buckles and cooking pots. Or maybe it became part of the Umayyad Caliphate's bronze coinage. Or maybe it became weapons. We don't know. We'll never know. The sun god melted back into everyday objects. Sacred becoming mundane. Giant becoming fragments. Fragments becoming nothing we can trace. Let that image settle. 800 years of lying still. Then vanishing completely. No final resting place. No museum display. Just gone into the vast recycling system of human civilization, where everything eventually goes. Let's return to the Hanging Gardens and their identity crisis, because this might be the most fascinating disappearance of all. The disappearance that might not be a disappearance. The wonder that might have been somewhere else entirely. Stephanie Dalley's theory that the gardens were in Nineveh, not Babylon, has gained traction since the 1990s. And the evidence is surprisingly compelling. First, there's the problem of Babylonian silence. The Babylonians documented everything. Clay tablets, inscriptions, administrative records. But not one mentions gardens built by Nebuchadnezzar. Not one describes elaborate terraces or mountain plants brought to Babylon. This silence is deafening. Meanwhile, the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who ruled from Nineveh about a century earlier, wrote extensively about his gardens. He described them in detail. He mentioned a sophisticated aqueduct system bringing water from mountains 50 kilometers away. He talked about exotic plants, elevated terraces, engineering marvels. He even used the phrase, wonder for all peoples. Sound familiar? Sennacherib's gardens were real, documented, archaeologically traceable. In fact, archaeologists have found remains of his aqueduct system, stone channels, inscriptions, engineering works, everything matching his descriptions. So why do we think the gardens were in Babylon? Because Greek and Roman writers said so. But those writers were recording stories centuries after the fact. They'd never been to either city. They were working from travelers' tales, from cultural memory, from confused geography. And here's where the confusion probably happened. Babylon was more famous than Nineveh. By the time Greek writers were compiling lists of wonders, Nineveh had been destroyed for centuries. It was a memory, a ruin, a forgotten capital. But Babylon? Babylon was legendary. The city of Hammurabi's code. The city Alexander died in. When Greek writers heard stories about magnificent gardens in Mesopotamia, they probably assumed they were in Babylon, because that's where magnificent things were supposed to be. It's like someone in the future hearing about a massive gateway arch and assuming it's in New York instead of St. Louis. Famous cities attract stories. Lesser-known cities get forgotten. Dalley's theory also explains the timeline problem. Sennacherib built his gardens around 700 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar supposedly built his around 600 BCE. By 600 BCE, Sennacherib's gardens would have been about a century old. Old enough that details might be fuzzy. Young enough that travelers would still be talking about them. Perfect age for stories to migrate and get attributed to the wrong city. Historians still argue about this theory. Some find it convincing. Others remain skeptical. The skeptics point out that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe the Babylonian texts mentioning the gardens just haven't been found yet. Maybe they were on papyrus or other perishable materials that didn't survive. The believers counter that we've found thousands of Babylonian tablets. If the gardens were as magnificent as described, surely something would mention them. The debate continues. But here's what makes this relevant to our story. If the gardens were in Nineveh, we actually know what happened to them. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE. Brutally. Completely. The Medes and Babylonians sacked it, burned it, demolished it. The city that had been one of the world's greatest capitals became ruins. Any gardens would have been destroyed in that attack. Or, at the very least, abandoned immediately afterward. Without maintenance, they'd have died within weeks. So the gardens' disappearance isn't mysterious at all. They fell to war, to deliberate destruction, then to neglect and time. The irrigation systems were destroyed. The terraces collapsed. The plants died. Within a generation, there would have been nothing left but mud brick foundations. And mud brick melts in rain. By the time archaeologists started excavating Nineveh in the 1800s, any trace of gardens would have long since returned to dust. On the other hand, if the gardens were in Babylon, the story is different. Babylon declined gradually. It wasn't destroyed in one catastrophic siege. It just slowly emptied out after Alexander's death. People left. Trade routes shifted. Buildings fell into disrepair. The gardens, if they existed, would have been abandoned. Irrigation systems would have clogged and failed. Exotic plants would have died. Local plants might have taken over for a while, creating a wild tangle. But eventually, without water, even those would die. By the Roman period, there would have been nothing to see. Just mounds. Tells. The landscape of abandoned mud brick. Either way, Nineveh or Babylon, the ending is the same. Gardens need constant maintenance. Cut off that maintenance, and they vanish quickly, much faster than stone monuments. Plants die. Soil erodes. Irrigation channels fill with silt. Within a century, you wouldn't know there had been gardens there at all. The eccentric detail. Some scholars think the confusion between Babylon and Nineveh might have been deliberate. Later writers wanted the seven wonders to be geographically distributed. If the gardens were in Nineveh, that's very close to where other wonders were. But Babylon? That's farther east. Better distribution. So maybe someone along the way shifted the location to make the list more balanced. It's the kind of editorial decision that seems harmless at the time. But 2,000 years later, it leaves us arguing about which city had the gardens that might not have existed. The truth is lost somewhere in the gap between what happened and what was written down. Somewhere between the 7th century BCE and the 1st century CE. Somewhere in the process of stories becoming legends, becoming lists. And honestly, maybe it doesn't matter. Whether the gardens were in Babylon or Nineveh, they're gone. Whether they were real or exaggerated or completely mythical, we can't visit them. We're left with the same thing either way. Descriptions in old texts, images in our imagination, and a gentle uncertainty of not quite knowing, which is its own kind of peaceful. Not everything needs a definitive answer. Sometimes maybe is enough. The statue of Zeus took a journey. Maybe, if we believe the second theory of its disappearance, the statue was dismantled in Olympia and transported to Constantinople. Let's imagine what that would have taken. The statue was about 40 feet tall, made of ivory panels attached to a wooden framework covered with gold drapery, sitting on an elaborate throne of cedar, ebony, ivory, and precious stones. To move it, you'd have to dismantle it carefully. Remove the gold sheets first. They're valuable and relatively easy to detach. Then the ivory panels. These are fragile, ancient, prone to cracking. Each one would need to be wrapped, cushioned, protected. The wooden framework could be disassembled into sections. The throne would come apart in pieces. The whole process would take weeks, months even. You'd need skilled craftsmen who understood the statue's construction, people who could take it apart without destroying it. Then you'd need to transport everything, from Olympia to the coast, by wagon, carefully, then by ship to Constantinople, across the Aegean Sea, each piece wrapped and secured against the motion of the waves. It's a massive logistical operation, expensive, time-consuming, risky. So why do it? Constantinople was becoming the new Rome, the eastern capital of the empire. Emperors were collecting classical treasures from across the Mediterranean. Statues, columns, obelisks, anything that demonstrated Rome's cultural superiority. A 40-foot golden ivory Zeus would be the ultimate prize. Proof that Constantinople was the true heir to classical civilization. Some sources suggest Emperor Theodosius II ordered the transfer. He ruled from 408 to 450 CE. During his reign, Constantinople was being embellished with monuments. The statue might have been installed in the Palace of Lausus, a private palace owned by a wealthy official who collected classical art. The palace supposedly housed other famous statues, the Aphrodite of Knidos, the Athena of Lindos. Zeus would fit right in. A museum before museums existed. A collection of the ancient world's greatest hits. Then, according to Byzantine chronicler Georgios Kadrinos, a fire destroyed the Palace of Lausus in 475 CE. The building burned. The statues were lost, including possibly the statue of Zeus. But Kadrinos was writing in the 11th century, 600 years after the supposed fire. His account is vague, possibly confused with other fires. Constantinople had many fires, many destroyed palaces. Details blur over centuries. So we're left with uncertainty. Did the statue go to Constantinople? Maybe. Did it burn there? Maybe. Or did it burn in Olympia, never leaving Greece at all? Also maybe. Historians still argue. Some point to the transportation logistics as proof it couldn't have been moved. Too difficult, too expensive, Too risky. Others argue that if anyone could manage it, the late Roman Empire could. They moved entire obelisks from Egypt to Rome. They transported massive marble columns across the Mediterranean. Moving a disassembled statue wouldn't be impossible, just difficult. Here's what we know for certain. By the 6th century, there was no statue of Zeus. Not in Olympia, not in Constantinople, not anywhere. Every account after that point speaks of it in the past tense. There was a great statue. It used to stand in Olympia. Gone. Vanished. Whether by fire in Greece or fire in Turkey, the result was the same. The ivory burned or was too damaged to salvage. The gold was melted down and repurposed. The wooden framework became ash. The throne's precious materials were scattered. Within a generation, nobody alive had seen the intact statue. Within 2 generations, it was a memory. Within 3, it was a legend. The eccentric detail. Some scholars think the statue was already in poor condition before it was destroyed or moved. Ivory doesn't age well without constant maintenance. By the 5th century CE, the statue was 800 years old. Even with the olive oil pool and dedicated caretakers, there would have been cracks. Discoloration. Repairs. The statue people described in the 1st century BCE might have been significantly different from the one that existed in the 5th century CE. Less pristine, more patched together. Still impressive, but showing its age. Maybe that made its destruction less tragic to contemporary witnesses. They weren't losing a perfect masterpiece. They were losing an ancient, deteriorating statue that reminded them of gods they no longer worshipped. From our perspective, with our reverence for antiquity, this seems like a catastrophic loss. But to them, maybe just the end of something that had already been ending for a long time. The statue's disappearance is frustrating precisely because we don't know the details. Did it burn? Was it dismantled? Both? Did it end in one dramatic fire or a series of smaller indignities? We'll never know. All we have are competing theories and sparse documentary evidence. But in a way, that uncertainty is appropriate. Zeus was the god of the sky, of things above and beyond human understanding. Maybe it's fitting that his statue's end remains mysterious, up in the clouds of historical ambiguity, beyond our ability to pin down with certainty, gone in a way that leaves room for imagination, for different stories, different possibilities. The god who controlled storms and lightning, vanishing in a confusion of smoke and contradictory accounts. There's a poetry to that, even if it's not the poetry we'd prefer. We'd prefer certainty, clear timelines, definitive answers. But history doesn't always provide those. Sometimes it just provides the quiet acknowledgement that something was once there, and now it's not. And the exact moment of transition from presence to absence is lost, somewhere in the gaps between centuries. Let that thought drift. A giant statue disappearing into uncertainty, present, then absent, with the middle part unknown. Like sleep itself. You're awake, then time passes, then you're awake again, and the transition is mysterious, unmarked, gone before you notice it going. So which was worse for the wonders, nature or humanity? It's a question worth considering. Earthquakes versus stone thieves. Tectonic plates versus practical building needs. Acts of God versus acts of pragmatic self-interest. Let's tally them up. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. Earthquakes knocked it down. Humans carted it away. Split decision. The Colossus of Rhodes. Earthquake toppled it. Humans eventually melted it down. Split decision again. The Mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Earthquakes weakened it. Crusaders finished it off. Another split. The Temple of Artemis. Human arson destroyed it the first time. Human religious ideology destroyed it the second time. Entirely human. The statue of Zeus. Possibly fire. Possibly religious pressure. Possibly both. Mostly human. The Hanging Gardens. If they existed, probably war or neglect. Human, or at least human adjacent. The Great Pyramid. Earthquakes loosened the stones. Humans took them. Split decision. So the score is roughly equal. Nature and humanity working together to erase the ancient world's greatest achievements. It's a partnership. Earthquakes do the dramatic work. cracking foundations, toppling columns, creating opportunities. Then humans come along and do the cleanup, taking the fallen stones, repurposing the materials, finishing what nature started. Very efficient, really. Nature is the demolition crew. Humanity is the salvage operation. But here's the interesting part. Natural destruction tends to leave traces. Earthquake damage creates ruins, collapsed sections, broken columns, scattered stones, things archaeologists can study, reconstruct, learn from. Human destruction, especially when thorough, leaves much less. When people systematically dismantle a structure and cart away every stone to use elsewhere, there's nothing left. No ruins to excavate. No architectural elements to study. Just empty ground where something once stood. The mausoleum site is a good example. If earthquakes alone had destroyed it, we'd have impressive ruins. Toppled columns, scattered sculptures, clear evidence of the structure's scale. But because humans took most of it away, the site is nearly empty. Just foundation trenches. A few scattered fragments. Most of the mausoleum is hiding in the walls of Bodrum Castle. Dispersed, disguised, unrecognizable as a wonder. The same with the Great Pyramid's casing stones. If earthquakes had simply dislodged them, they'd be piled around the pyramid's base. Instead, they're scattered across Cairo in hundreds of buildings. Harder to trace, harder to understand, harder to appreciate. So in terms of historical understanding, human destruction is arguably worse. It erases more completely. In terms of immediate drama, natural destruction is more impressive. An earthquake is sudden, violent, catastrophic. Stone removal is gradual, methodical, boring. But boring destruction can be more thorough than dramatic destruction. Historians still argue about whether we should blame ancient people for not preserving the wonders. Some argue they had a responsibility to future generations. These were marvels, masterpieces, cultural treasures. They should have been protected at all costs. Others argue that's an unfair, anachronistic judgment. Preservation is a modern luxury. Ancient and medieval people were just trying to survive. If survival meant using old stone for new buildings, so be it. Both perspectives have merit. Yes, it would be wonderful if the wonders had been preserved. We'd have 7 incredible ancient structures to visit instead of just one. But also, yes, people needed building materials more than they needed monuments to gods they no longer worshipped. It's hard to blame someone for choosing practical needs over abstract heritage. Here's the reality. The wonders disappeared because they stopped being useful. The lighthouse stopped guiding ships when Alexandria declined. The temple stopped hosting worshippers when Christianity arrived. The Olympic Games stopped, so Zeus's statue lost its purpose. The mausoleum was a tomb for people long dead and forgotten. The Colossus watched over a harbor that no longer needed a guardian god. When things lose their function, they become vulnerable. They're no longer actively maintained, no longer defended, no longer valued. They become, essentially, very large piles of raw materials. And humanity has never been good at leaving raw materials unused. The eccentric detail. Some of the wonders might have survived if they'd been cheaper to build. Stone structures were targets because stone is valuable. If the lighthouse had been built of brick, it might still be standing. Nobody wants to steal bricks. They're cheap and plentiful. But massive granite and limestone blocks? Those are worth the effort. The wonders were victims of their own quality. Built too well. Built too expensively. Built in ways that made them valuable as building materials after their original purpose ended. So which is worse, nature or humanity? The answer is, it doesn't matter. Both are just forces of change. Earthquakes happen because plates move. That's geology. Stone salvaging happens because people need materials. That's economics. Neither one is malicious. Neither one is avoidable. Together, they form the process by which ancient structures return to the material cycle. Stone from the earth becomes a monument, becomes building blocks, becomes something else. Round and round. Nothing is permanent. Everything is eventually recycled. The wonders were just high-profile examples of a universal process. They stood longer than most buildings, impressed more people than most structures, But in the end, they followed the same path everything follows. From earth to monument to earth again, with a middle period of being walls and mosques and castles in between. It's not tragedy. It's just transformation, the natural order of things. Let that thought settle without resistance. Nothing lasts. Everything changes. Even wonders. Even marvels. Even the greatest achievements humans have ever built. All temporary. All transitional. All just waiting for the next earthquake or the next builder with a need for stone. It's peaceful in a way, knowing nothing is required to last forever. Knowing everything will eventually become something else. The pressure is off. The expectations are released. Just existence. Just time. Just change. Slow and steady and utterly, completely inevitable. The wonders grew in the telling. That's worth remembering. By the time we hear about them, they've passed through generations of writers, each one adding a little something, emphasizing different aspects, filling in gaps with imagination. The original structures were impressive, certainly, but the legendary wonders? Those are partly real, partly myth. Consider the Colossus. Ancient sources give wildly different heights. Some say 70 cubits tall. Others say the statue was 70 feet. Still others suggest it was over 100 feet. That's a range from roughly 100 feet to 150 feet. A 50-foot margin of error on a statue's height. Nobody who wrote about it had actually measured it. They were estimating, guessing, going by impressions. And impressions tend toward exaggeration. It was very tall becomes, it was impossibly tall becomes, it was the tallest thing ever made. The Hanging Gardens supposedly had trees so large they looked like they were growing from mountains. Water cascaded down through multiple levels in a continuous flow. Exotic plants from across the known world flourished in perfect conditions. It sounds magical, impossible almost. And maybe it was impossible. Maybe the real gardens, if they existed, were nice terrace gardens with some imported plants and a clever irrigation system. Still impressive, still worth visiting, but not quite the miracle described in later texts. The lighthouse was supposedly visible from 35 miles away. That's actually impossible with ancient lamp technology and the curvature of the earth. But visible from very far away is less impressive than visible from 35 miles. So the number gets inflated. The statue of Zeus was so overwhelming that people wept upon seeing it. Maybe some did. Maybe it was genuinely moving. Or maybe that's what writers said because it was big and impressive doesn't make for compelling prose. Historians still argue about how much to trust ancient descriptions. Some take them fairly literally, assuming the structures were roughly as described. Others apply heavy skepticism, assuming significant exaggeration. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The structures were genuinely impressive by ancient standards, but they were also enhanced by storytelling, by cultural pride, by the telephone game of repeated retellings. Here's the problem. Once something becomes legendary, the legend replaces the reality. Nobody cares what the actual Colossus looked like. They care about the mythical Colossus, the one straddling the harbor, impossibly huge, visible for miles. That image is more powerful than any historical reality could be. The same with the Hanging Gardens. The real gardens, if they existed, would have been constrained by engineering, by water availability, by plant biology. But the legendary gardens? Those can be as impossible as imagination allows. Waterfalls that defy gravity. Trees that shouldn't survive in that climate. Magic disguised as engineering. By the time the wonders were codified into the canonical list of 7, they'd already been transformed. From impressive structures to mythical marvels. From things people had seen to things people had heard about. From reality to legend. And here's the interesting part. The legend is what lasted. The physical structures crumbled, burned, got carted away. But the story survived. For over 2,000 years, people have been reading about the 7 wonders. Imagining them, drawing them, writing about them. The wonders became more famous in destruction than they ever were while standing. Most ancient people never saw them. Too far away, too expensive to visit, too inaccessible. But they heard the stories, and stories get better with distance. The eccentric detail, the list of 7 wonders wasn't even standardized until relatively late. Different writers had different lists. Some included the walls of Babylon instead of the Hanging Gardens. Some included the Ishtar Gate, or the Palace of Cyrus, or various other structures. The list we know today, with the pyramid, lighthouse, gardens, temple, statue, mausoleum, and colossus, became canonical somewhat arbitrarily. These were just the ones that happened to appear together in the most widely copied texts. The winners of a literary popularity contest. So we're not even dealing with the real 7 most impressive structures. We're dealing with the 7 that happen to capture imagination and get written about most. There might have been more impressive structures that simply didn't have good publicity. This is the memory problem of ancient wonders. We remember what gets written down, what gets repeated, what captures imagination. Everything else, no matter how impressive, fades away. The wonders became templates for how we think about impressive architecture. Any large statue becomes like the Colossus. Any tall lighthouse is compared to Alexandria's. Any elaborate tomb invokes the mausoleum. They transcended their physical existence. They became metaphors, archetypes, measuring sticks. And in that form, they're truly immortal. You can destroy a statue, but you can't destroy the idea of that statue. You can dismantle a temple, but you can't erase the memory of what a temple should aspire to be. The physical wonders disappeared, but the conceptual wonders grew stronger, more perfect in absence than they ever were in presence, unburdened by cracks, weathering, maintenance needs, or disappointing reality, existing in a permanent state of idealized magnificence. Is that better or worse than surviving? Hard to say. If the wonders had survived, we could visit them, touch them, understand them, but we'd also see their flaws, their limitations, their inevitable ordinariness. In destruction, they remain perfect, forever impressive, forever beyond criticism, forever existing in that space between history and myth where legends live. Maybe that's the real wonder. Not what they were, but what they became. Not the structures themselves, but the stories. Stories that have lasted longer than stone. Stories that will probably outlast us too. Let that thought drift softly. Stories outlasting stone. Memory outlasting reality. The imagined becoming more powerful than the actual. It's backwards from what we'd expect. But it's true. The wonders live on. Just not where we think. Not in ruins or museums or archaeological sites. But in the space between what was and what we wish had been. In the gap where history becomes story, becomes legend, becomes dream. That's where they still stand. Perfect, eternal, untouchable, safe from earthquakes and stone thieves and time itself. Now let's talk about what's actually left. Because despite everything, earthquakes, fires, religious transformation, stone theft, time, traces remain. Small things. Foundation stones. Fragments. Enough to prove the wonders existed. Enough to study, to measure, to understand, at least partially. The Great Pyramid, of course, still stands. Stripped of its casing, missing its golden cap, but fundamentally intact. You can walk around it, climb it, though you're not supposed to. Go inside and see the burial chambers. It's the control group, the one that made it through. At the Temple of Artemis site in Turkey, there's almost nothing. Just foundation trenches. One reconstructed column. British archaeologist John Turtle Wood excavated it in the 1870s after 6 years of searching through swamps. He found enough to confirm the location, to map the temple's footprint. He shipped sculptural fragments back to the British Museum. Relief panels showing Greeks fighting Amazons. Carved column drums. Architectural elements. Pieces of the temple scattered in a museum thousands of miles from where they stood. Today, if you visit Ephesus, you see that single column rising from an empty field. One pillar where once there were 127. It's lonely, evocative, strangely moving. The mausoleum site in Bodrum has a similar story. Charles Newton excavated it in the 1850s. He found a foundation cut into bedrock. The empty burial chamber. Scattered architectural fragments. Pieces of the famous sculptures. He sent the best pieces to the British Museum. The lions that guarded the tomb. Sections of the Amazon frieze. Parts of the chariot horses. fragments of one of the ancient world's most elaborate tombs, now in glass cases in London. At the site itself, foundations, scattered stones, information placards, the outline of magnificence, the ghost of the mausoleum, the Lighthouse of Alexandria left underwater ruins. In the 1990s, French archaeologist Jean-Yves Empereur mapped over 3,000 stone blocks on the harbor floor. Granite columns, limestone architectural elements, possible statue fragments. Some pieces weigh 75 tons, far too large for medieval builders to have moved. So they stayed where they fell, sank into the harbor, became part of the seafloor. Divers can visit them now, swim through the ruins of the lighthouse. It's eerie. Archaeological sites usually involve digging down. This one involves diving down. The past beneath water instead of beneath earth. The citadel of Cape Bay stands above, built from the lighthouse's upper sections. So the lighthouse exists in two forms: underwater ruins and repurposed fortress, split between ocean and architecture. For the statue of Zeus, archaeologists found Phidias's workshop at Olympia. Pottery fragments with his name, tools for working gold and ivory, clay molds, proof that the statue was made, that the descriptions weren't entirely fabricated. But of the statue itself, nothing. Not a single fragment of ivory, not a scrap of gold, just the workshop where it was created, and the temple foundation where it stood. The Colossus left even less. No confirmed foundation, no fragments, no physical trace, just descriptions in ancient texts, images on coins. It's the most completely vanished wonder, existing now only as words and imagination. The Hanging Gardens left nothing at all. If they were in Babylon, no trace survives. If they were in Nineveh, they're mixed with all the other ruins of that destroyed city. Either way, no gardens, no irrigation systems, no terrace structures clearly identifiable as the wonder. The most mythical wonder left the least evidence. Appropriate, somehow. Historians still argue about what these fragments tell us. Can we reconstruct the wonders from pieces? From foundations? From descriptions? Some say yes. Others say we're just projecting our expectations onto ambiguous evidence. The truth is somewhere between. We know the wonders existed. We know roughly what they looked like. But the details? Those are educated guesses. Reconstructions based on fragments and texts and architectural logic. Imagine completeness assembled from incomplete parts. Here's the eccentric detail. Modern technology is finding new evidence. Ground-penetrating radar, underwater sonar mapping, satellite imagery. These tools are revealing structures that traditional excavation missed. In Egypt, radar has found cavities in the Great Pyramid that might be hidden chambers. In Turkey, remote sensing has revealed the full extent of ancient Ephesus, including areas around the Temple of Artemis. In Alexandria's harbor, sonar mapping continues to find new lighthouse fragments. We're not done discovering what's left. Every few years, another fragment emerges. Another foundation is mapped. Another piece of the puzzle appears. The wonders are still revealing themselves. Slowly, gradually, one stone at a time. Museums hold pieces. Archaeological sites preserve foundations. Private collections contain fragments. The wonders are dispersed, but not entirely gone. Scattered across the world like pieces of a puzzle that can never be fully reassembled. But each piece proves they existed. Each fragment confirms the stories weren't entirely mythical. There really was a lighthouse, a temple, a statue, a tomb. They really were magnificent. And then they really did fall. The fragments don't let us rebuild them, but they do let us remember them accurately. Ground our imagination in physical reality. Connect the legendary with the actual. It's enough. Not everything needs to survive intact to matter. Sometimes fragments are sufficient. Sometimes just knowing something existed, that was real, that it stood, that people built it and marveled at it, is enough. The traces prove the wonders weren't fantasies. They were achievements, accomplishments, real things in real space that existed once, and in existing, proved humans could create beauty and scale and ambition that lasted centuries. Even if not forever, even if ultimately scattered into museums and fortress walls and seafloor sediment. They existed, they mattered, and tiny fragments remember. Let that settle gently. Fragments remembering, stones bearing witness, small pieces testifying to former magnificence. Not the whole story, but enough of it. Enough to know something beautiful was once here. And now it's there, and there, and there. Scattered but not lost. Dispersed but not forgotten. Small, quiet, patient, waiting in museums and underwater and fortress walls. Waiting for someone to recognize them. To say, this was once part of something magnificent. And it still is in its way. Just in smaller pieces now. Just in gentler forms. Just resting. Waiting. Remembering. And so we return to where we started. The Great Pyramid of Giza. The only wonder still standing. The survivor. Not because it was better built than the others, necessarily. Not because it was more beautiful or more sacred or more important. But because it was massive. Too massive to fully dismantle. Too solid to topple completely. Too much pyramid to disappear. The Great Pyramid survived through sheer stubborn bulk. 2.3 million stone blocks. Even after losing its white casing. Even after centuries of stone theft. There's still so much pyramid left that it remains impressive. Monumental. Undeniable. You can stand at its base and feel dwarfed. Look up at the stepped limestone rising into the sky. Try to imagine those blocks being set in place 4,500 years ago. Without modern machinery. Without computers. Without the engineering knowledge we take for granted. Just human labor. Human planning. Human ambition. And there it stands. Weathered. Stripped. Diminished from its original glory. But standing. The last wonder. The only one that refused to completely vanish. It's seen civilizations rise and fall. Ancient Egypt collapsed. Greece rose and fell. Rome conquered and crumbled. Islam spread. The Ottomans came and went. Colonial powers divided the world and withdrew. And through it all, the pyramid stood, watching, silent, patient, the longest-lasting human structure on Earth. Not the tallest anymore, not the most impressive by modern standards, but the oldest, the most enduring, a testament to what humans can build when we commit to permanence, when we build not for ourselves, but for eternity. Of course, even the pyramid won't last forever. Wind erodes stone, rain dissolves limestone, temperature changes create stress fractures. In another few thousand years, the pyramid will be smaller, more weathered, more broken. Eventually, given enough time, it too will return to the desert. A pile of stones, then sand, then dust. Everything ends, even this. But not yet, not soon. For now, the pyramid stands, a bridge between the ancient world and ours. A physical connection to people who lived so long ago we can barely comprehend the distance. They built this. We can touch it. That's miraculous in its way. More miraculous than any story about hanging gardens or bronze giants. Because it's real. It's here. It's touchable. You can fly to Cairo. Take a taxi to Giza. Walk right up to it. Press your hand against limestone blocks that were set in place before writing was common. Before iron was widely used, before most of the cities we know existed. That continuity is staggering. The pyramid connects us to the dawn of civilization. It's a reminder that humans have always built, always created, always reached for something beyond mere survival. We've always wanted to leave something behind, something that says, we were here, we mattered, we could do this. The other 6 wonders said that too. And for a time, they succeeded. They stood. They impressed. They inspired. They fulfilled their purpose. And then they transformed, became something else, served new purposes. Their stones live on in mosques and fortresses and harbor fortifications. Their stories live on in texts and imagination. Their ambition lives on in every generation that tries to build something lasting. The wonders didn't fail. They just had different lifespans than we'd prefer. Some lasted centuries. Some lasted millennia. All of them lasted long enough to matter. Long enough to be remembered. Long enough to inspire lists and histories and late-night scripts for people trying to fall asleep. And that's enough. That's all any creation can hope for. to exist, to matter, to be remembered, even if only in fragments, even if only in stories, even if only as cautionary tales about how nothing lasts forever. The sun is setting now over Giza, metaphorically, in your imagination. Golden light washing across the pyramid's stepped face. Shadows lengthening in the grooves between blocks. The desert cooling as evening approaches. Everything settling into stillness. The tourists have gone home. The vendors have packed up. It's just you and the pyramid now. You and 4,500 years of human aspiration. You and the last wonder still standing. And it's peaceful, quiet. The pyramid doesn't demand anything from you. Doesn't need your admiration or your understanding. It just exists. Solid, patient, present. The way it has been for longer than you can imagine. The way it will be long after you're gone. There's comfort in that. In permanence that doesn't require your attention. In monuments that outlast personal worries. In stones that were old when your ancestors were young and will be here when your descendants are old. The scale of time involved makes everything else seem small. Manageable. Temporary. Your concerns. Your anxieties. Your restless thoughts. All temporary. All small against the backdrop of 4,500 years. Let them be small. Let them fade. Let the pyramid's patient existence remind you that most things resolve themselves eventually. That time handles most problems if you give it long enough. That even wonders fall, and that's okay. That endings are just transformations. That nothing is truly lost, just changed. The stones are still here. Somewhere. In walls and fortresses and museum displays and seafloor sediment. The stories are still here. In books and conversations and sleepy narrations. The ambition is still here. In every person who tries to create something lasting. Nothing disappears completely. It just becomes something else. Quietly. Gradually. Inevitably. The way you're becoming sleep now. Your thoughts slowing. Your breathing deepening. The boundaries between wake and rest blurring. The ancient world fading into comfortable distance. Pyramids and lighthouses and bronze giants all settling into the soft landscape of near sleep. Where everything is possible and nothing hurts. Where wonders stand forever because time doesn't exist. Where stones don't fall and gardens never wilt and statues never topple. Where the ancient world is still bright and new and gleaming. Where everything lasts, everything matters, everything rests, just like you. Safe, comfortable, drifting, letting go of the day, letting go of thought, letting the wonders do what they do best now. Not standing, not impressing, just being gentle companions as you slip into sleep. Ancient, patient, kind, watching over you the way they watched over harbors and cities and pilgrims. Steady, unchanging, there. And you're there too. Here. Now. Safe. Surrounded by the quiet presence of monuments that have seen everything. And found it all, ultimately, peaceful. The way you're finding peace now. The way sleep finds everyone eventually. Gentle. Inevitable. Welcome. Let come. The wonders are settled. The stories are told. The ancient world is sleeping. You can sleep too. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to remember. Just stones and time and the soft descent into rest. Sweet dreams.